Let's now look at the components of a skeletal muscle. What we're going to do is work from more of a macroscopic, gross anatomy level, all the way down to the tissue level and then finally the cellular level. So really what we need to do is get down to the cell level, and once we understand the muscle cell, we can look at how that single muscle cell is going to contract. Because ultimately how a muscle contracts is based upon how all of its muscle cells contract. So what we have here is a muscle attached to a bone using a tendon. Recall that tendon is made up of some regular connective tissue, a lot of collagen fibers in that tendon, attaching it very strongly to this bone. There would be another end of this muscle attached to some other bone, and we'll learn more about what these attachment sites are called, but typically one end of a muscle is known as the origin, and the other end of the muscle is called the insertion. If we look inside the muscle, we notice that there are bundles of cells called a fascicle. A fascicle is surrounded by connective tissue. So there's a lot of connective tissue in this muscle. It's not just cells. The connective tissues kind of wrap the entire muscle with a protective covering. Then there are some layers that bundle up muscle cells into what's called a fascicle, and we see that here. And then we are zooming closer in at that bundle of muscle cells. And then notice we are actually pulling out here one single muscle cell. And muscle cells are named slightly differently depending on who's describing them, but you might see muscle fiber or muscle cell or even myocyte describing the single cell level. Notice that this single cell level has a number of nuclei in it. It's a skeletal muscle cell, so it's multinucleated. You'll also notice that there's quite a bit of blood supply inside this muscle, so there are some arteries and veins in there. And then this yellow guy here is a neuron. We're going to learn that the neurons that control skeletal muscle are called somatic motor neurons. So we worked our way down to that single cell level, and then we look inside of that single cell, and there seems to be some rod-like structures within that single cell. And those rod-like structures are known as myofibrils. And we'll be taking a very close look at how those rod-like structures contract within the muscle cell. So what we have here is that single cell. Notice this does not look at all like the cell you learn about in a biology class. And that this cell is a very specialized cell in that it's a skeletal myocyte or skeletal muscle cell. And instead of being spherical, it's going to be very long and cylindrical. But it still has some of the familiar structures that typical cells have, like a plasma membrane around the outside. And that plasma membrane, when we're looking at muscle cells, is known as the sarcolemma. Sarco means flesh, lemma means layer. So this is just kind of a layer, or the plasma membrane, of the muscle cell. We also see that there are some tube-like extensions of the sarcolemma. These tube-like extensions are known as transverse tubules because they run kind of across the diameter of the muscle cell. And these are going to be important for us a little later on when we talk about how electrical current is going to be introduced and travel along the sarcolemma of the muscle cell. And in order to get that electrical current deep down into the muscle cell, there needs to be these tube-like extensions of the plasma membrane. The fluid inside the muscle cell is known as sarcoplasm. You've probably heard of cytoplasm. If we're looking at the cytoplasm of a muscle cell, it's often called sarcoplasm. And there's a couple components in there that are going to be extremely important for us when we get to muscle contraction and muscle physiology. The sarcoplasm is rich in glycogen and myoglobin. Now, I believe we've mentioned glycogen in the past. Glycogen is a carbohydrate. More specifically, it's a polysaccharide. So glycogen is, in essence, a bunch of glucose monosaccharides put together to form a larger stored version of glucose. So these skeletal muscle cells can store up a lot of energy in the form of glycogen. And it's a little easier and quicker to get the energy from glycogen as it would be from, say, triglycerides. Triglycerides are more of a long-term energy storage, whereas glycogen is a little more short-term, and then obviously glucose is the immediate source of energy. So glycogen becomes extremely important when we get to how this muscle cell can generate enough ATP to facilitate muscle contraction. There's also a protein called myoglobin. So glycogen is a carbohydrate. Myoglobin is a protein. And notice it kind of looks like another protein you may have heard of called hemoglobin. Hemoglobin is an oxygen-carrying protein in your blood. So hemo refers to blood. Globin is the protein that knows how to transport oxygen. But myoglobin is inside muscle. So myoglobin is a protein that can store up oxygen for that muscle cell. So those are the two important components necessary for energy production. If you think about energy production, what do you need? You need a source of energy, that's going to be glucose from the glycogen, and then you need oxygen. You need oxygen to facilitate or allow aerobic cellular respiration. So both of these components are rich in the sarcoplasm of muscle cells, and they're utilized during cellular respiration and the production of energy. What else do we see? We see a structure, an organelle that's very network-like, some little tubes in there, but that's known as the sarcoplasmic reticulum. You've probably heard of endoplasmic reticulum, and you probably remember that the endoplasmic reticulum has a rough and smooth portion. This is the smooth endoplasmic reticulum. And it's very extensive in muscle cells. And the major function that we're going to talk about in relation to the sarcoplasmic reticulum is to store calcium. Calcium is vital for muscle contraction. You must have calcium. But you can't just have calcium floating around everywhere. It needs to be stored during relaxation, but then released to promote contraction. So this sarcoplasmic reticulum is going to be an extremely important organelle in order to store and then release calcium. Then, as I mentioned previously, there are these long rod-like structures called myofibrils. These myofibrils are largely protein-based, a lot of different proteins in these rod structures. And these proteins we're going to talk about in the upcoming lectures, in that they're facilitating contraction. But if you notice, these rods run lengthwise down the myocyte. So it's really, however these rods contract, that's how the single cell is going to contract. And then how a single cell contracts, you put many of those together, and that's how a muscle is going to ultimately contract. When we look inside of these rods, we see that there's these single contractile units called sarcomeres. So sarcomere extends from this little zigzag line to this little zigzag line. Of course, zigzag lines have special names we're going to get to. But that unit can actually contract. This is the smallest you can get and still be able to contract. So we call that the contractile units. And then notice they are just attached end to end. There's one here, a sarcomere. There's going to be a sarcomere here, all the way down the entire length of the myofibrils. Then we look inside of a sarcomere, and you'll notice that there's some lines. Those are known as filaments. These are made up of protein. There's thick myofilaments made up of a protein called myosin, we're going to talk about. And then there are these thin myofilaments that have a protein called actin. And actin and myosin are the basic proteins used to cause muscle contraction. So what we've done is we started off at the gross anatomy level, looked at a muscle, a tendon, a bone. We started to get smaller and smaller at the cellular level. Now we're all the way down at the molecular level because these filaments, these myofilaments, are made up of proteins, and proteins are molecules. So to understand muscle physiology, you really have to get down to the molecules, the proteins. You can also notice in this drawing a couple other organelles should look familiar. These are mitochondria, which are going to be very important for these guys in the production of ATP. And then you have your nuclei kind of pushed off to the edges. This drawing shows 3 nuclei. Again, emphasizing that skeletal muscle cells are multinucleated. The next video, we're going to start to look at the actual proteins, the molecules that are involved in muscle contraction.